All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to begin our webinar, and we have a really good one for you. So, before we kick off, I'm just going to run through a few house rules for all of our attendees. Keep everything civil. That is rule number one. Everything else follows from that. We have a chat function. Introduce yourself there. Say hello to everyone else who's here. Feel free to use that as a mode of communication. We have the Q&A function, which is built into Zoom. Feel free to use that to send over questions for our panelists at any point in time during the discussion. I will try and weave them in if they are relevant to the topic we're discussing, or we will be using a Q&A session right at the end after our discussion to address some of your concerns. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. We have Mr. Tawisak from Vichai Trading 1983. We have Didier from Televic, and we have Gavin from Pro AV Solutions. They will be giving their thoughts about critical communications in the government sector. So what we mean by critical communications is the fact that certain form of communications are just a little bit more important than others. Let's say there's a parliament session going on for the exact government that runs your country. That's a little bit more important than a VC Connect that two people might have scheduled for later in the day just to catch up about work things. I would like to start the conversation on the topic of change. Now, we know that the government sector is very slow to change. Sometimes they resist that. But over the past 2 years, due to the pandemic, they've had to change because the circumstances are not the same anymore. Gavin, I would like to hear from you regarding the changes you have seen in the government sector, the changes you've seen in government spaces, such as parliaments, municipal courts, district council meeting spaces, basically what has happened.
So thank you and welcome everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. So what we've seen here, so my particular patch is in Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. So we're in the Sunshine State up the road from the Gold Coast. So we have very large councils on a global scale. We actually, I think Brisbane City Council, for instance, is the largest by area in the world. So it's a significant large council area. And the biggest impacts that we've seen is the attendance in chambers meetings, for instance, because of COVID, means obviously that whilst they attempted the in-person meetings, everybody had to be isolated by 1.5 meters, and the space just doesn't often allow for that. So what council did eventually, and other councils similar to that, is to have these chambers meetings online, which would mean obviously no representation inside the council chambers at all. So not only is that a technical challenge for councils, but there's also legislative challenges as well, because they're bound, because they're a public council. All this needs to be recorded and needs to be transcribed, etc. For Brisbane City Council's example. So from a technology point of view, council in the early days were consuming pretty much what we're doing now, for instance, over Zoom. So that impacts their workflow and their meetings generally, because using voting, for example, they're not amenable to using any electronic means. So during voting is a show of hands. So everyone's got to stick their hand up if they agree or disagree. So councils had to adapt to those events. Now that the pandemic for us is easing, councils been back in chambers now for several months and several sessions, and this is consistent with sort of all the councils that we look after. But during that time, the gallery, for instance, public gallery is not open. The public's not welcome to attend. So whilst the chambers meetings can commence as normal, there's this bigger and larger influence on ensuring that the public is engaged with streaming and recording abilities, which is what they were doing previously, but obviously there's more of an emphasis on that now. So the public now join these meetings, for instance, via Teams platform or any other web conferencing platform like we are now, for instance. So that the most significant changes, I guess, is adapting to those so quickly. So because of the pandemic, obviously, no one was aware that was coming until it happened, and the local councils did adapt to that quickly. So, but from a technology point of view, now, for instance, obviously what it's done is it's highlighted the requirement for councils to have resilient hardware and recording and streaming type solutions. So, where we've been engaged of late is councils prior to the pandemic may have had multiple contractors on site delivering different parts of the council experience. So some may have been managing cameras, some of them may have been managing streaming, for instance. So during this time, we've been able to, councils have recognised the importance for having one throat to choke. So one person to be responsible for delivering that chambers experience. So Pro-AV Solutions, fortunately, along with our colleagues on the call, Televic, we've deployed a number of systems across southeast Queensland that reflect the current requirements for council, which include cameras, conferencing systems, audio, video, streaming and recording, for instance, with full support from Pro-AV on site.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Mr. Tawisak, what are the trends you're seeing for government meeting spaces in Thailand, and how have they changed over the last 2 years?
Okay, from what happening now, because the government, they encourage their staff to work from home, right? So even in the daily personal life, recently I just lost my ID card. So in the past, we just walk into the government office and we get it within 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Now we have to register online. Everything you have to register online before you get into the service. So that's a changes procedure that the government adapting now, right? So in the government of conference room, meeting room today, in the past they almost doing something like the online meeting, but now the situation in Thailand is getting better on the pandemic. So right now it's more like a hybrid meeting room. So they still have people coming half of the room, but the rest they can do online. So that's what we're seeing, what happening nowadays. Because in the past, when you ask the government people to do video conferencing, they don't want to do it, right? For many reasons, technology, something like that. But now, almost every meeting room they want us to equip with the facility of video conference system, soft coded conference system. So we have to put conference microphone in. We have to put camera tracking, right? So those are the requirements that come in, and we have to do even the room with the existing conference and everything. We have to do something like to make the room able to do online. So it's more like a hybrid meeting room nowadays. So this is a good opportunity for us to upgrade all the existing conference system in the government sector. Yeah. So that's my comment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Didier, two extremely insightful responses, and the key thread across both of them is the insertion of digital, right? It's Mr. Tawisak was just talking about hybrid. He was talking about the fact that everything now requires that digital component. Gavin said something very similar about social distancing coming in and the public gallery not being there, and that requiring new ways of allowing governments to function. What are your thoughts been, and do we need a new breed of product to address these requirements?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say, when the pandemic hit, Televic, we were a little bit in panic also, because basically from the start, the solutions that we have are really for in-room participation, right? But very soon we kind of already adapted and also saw that basically there were still some requirements for conferencing solutions. Spreading out, making sure that people respected social distancing, situations where they put plastic walls in between people. Those are all things that don't help for the intelligibility of getting to hear and being heard. And that's basically where a conferencing solution really got into play. And we actually saw a huge increase in interest for our wireless solutions because of people moving out to different spaces. They went to a gymnasium, larger theater, and in order to facilitate that with technology and have the flexibility in that sense, we saw a huge increase in the wireless. So that's the first point. The second topic that we've seen is that also to give it a little bit more of an official character, that the mayor and some of the staff were in the council chambers and all the rest of the members were participating from home. So that's where the hybrid component came in. And obviously, what we've also recognized since the pandemic is that the appreciation for good quality audio has definitely risen as well. Obviously, if you start talking about hybrid solutions, you also want to see the people that you're talking to, right? It's also about a conversation, and the aspect of seeing somebody, the emotions, is really something that is very important. So the camera tracking solutions, whereas in the past, smaller municipalities and city councils were not really investing in those, you see now a tremendous request in camera tracking solutions. While we were switching also to the Teams and Zoom, we quickly also realized that for a lot of those organizations, procedural wise, the Teams and Zoom is really about connecting remote people. In our situation, the hybrid, with the layer of the governmental issues that need to, or procedures that need to be complied to, is totally different, right? So whatever procedures that we have in our conferencing solution, like for instance, requesting to speak, having a speaker list, the capability to vote, how do we deal with that, agenda management, what are we talking about? Those are the different components that we also kind of tried to adapt in a new hybrid solution that we are currently working on as well, which is called Confero Meet. So those are a little bit the different components that we have seen. And obviously streaming is one of the reasons also why a camera tracking solution is required, because more and more it's also about political marketing. Councillors want to show their constituents what they do, and the streaming component has now become a lot more important. While in the past people could go to the council chambers, nowadays that wasn't allowed. So the streaming component was in a lot of cases also a legal aspect that had to be done. Now that people have seen what it brings, and that a lot more constituents actually look to those streams or on-demand services, now all of a sudden all those government applications, especially city councils, are interested also in starting streaming solutions. So that's a little bit the three components that we saw in that respect.
Thank you so much, Didier. We've also got a question from the audience, which I feel is very pertinent to what we're talking about right now. Gavin, you highlighted that, hey, the pandemic is maybe coming under control, may differ from country to country, region to region, but in general, businesses are moving forward. We might be going from pandemic to endemic, right? The question is, do you think the changes that were enforced by the pandemic will stay, or will the government return to its old ways? And I would just like to add on to that question, Gavin. Do you think that the shift is gonna remain, or is there a new change coming right afterwards where maybe there's a little bit of scaling back, or maybe a new kind of normal emerges from one extreme to the other extreme?
Sorry, pardon me. I can answer that with an example. So with one of the larger Southeast Queensland councils, everybody was used to the remote chambers experiences via Zoom, for instance. So, and that occurred for months, many months. Then when councillors were able to return into chambers, it was a requirement of this particular council that if you wanted to vote, if you wanted to have an input into proceedings, you had to physically be in chambers. Now, obviously, everybody had just gone through a long experience of conducting these remote meetings. And one of the particular councillors at the time who was pregnant actually requested from this particular council permission to attend the chambers meetings remotely, because everybody had done that for the past several months. And at the time she was denied. And because the chambers in this particular area is party aligned, that she ran a bit of a muck. So she was able to convince council that she should be able to attend because they've just demonstrated that going through the process. So what I see now is it's likely to be in the very short term back to normal with people attending chambers, but it's really, I guess, adapting what's acceptable as far as legislation is concerned. I see that as a bit of an issue because no one wants to be the lone wolf on this. So I probably, the way that I see it, will probably go back to normal for a period of time until more and more technology enables the remote participants, for instance, like Didier mentioned with Televic's solution.
Mr. Tawisak, you talked about governments wanting more VC, wanting more digital, wanting more hybrid. Do you think that demand is going to continue for the next years, or do you think that once the pandemic is under control, that the demand for all these digital and hybrid solutions is going to decrease?
I believe that this will continue, even with pandemic or without pandemic, because this is the behavior is already changed. People feel more comfortable doing conference online and remotely if they are allowed to do that, because in the past they have to be present, they have to be in the meeting person. But I think now people get used to it, and I see the trend that the hybrid solution will be going on and on. Yeah.
That kind of transitions to the second topic that I wanted to discuss, which is the challenges that you guys face in the government sector. Now, Gavin's answer just recently pointed out some of the challenges, right? Governments are slow to change. Sometimes they are resistant to change. They do things in a certain way for a very long time, and they just don't want to switch that because they have a process and the process is fine. Mr. Tawisak, what are some of the challenges that you are facing in the government sector when you're trying to provide them meeting solutions and systems right now?
There is talking amongst the architect people that is all the end user that when they're building a new government office, new building, you know that for the conference system, 90% of the business is a government project. The private, they're not using conference, a private organization, they're not using conference system, they're using auto mixing microphone, right? But the main business for conference system is the government. So right now they're talking that because of the social distancing, right? People think that the online meeting, people think that the meeting room will be reduced because people can do online, or the number of people sitting in the room is less number. But because of the social distancing, you need more space. So the architect people, they are thinking that if they're going to design a new meeting room, the meeting room space needs to be bigger, or they can do it smaller, right? Because when you sit there, as mentioned, Didier said that you need to have a plastic partition or those kind of things, right? So for the existing project that we are working in, that already designed, I think they continue, but they want to add every room that able to do online conference system. In the past, maybe only 10% of the meeting room are equipped with online, but now 90%, right? But for the new project, Some of the architect or some of the government user, they say, we want bigger meeting room. You see, in Thailand, when we have a meeting in the government, in each meeting, we have 30 people, right? We don't have 10 people, 15 people. We have minimum 30 people or 60 people. So in the past, this room can accommodate 30 people or 60 people. But still, they still want to have 30 people. So there are two theories that, okay, they keep the same space, but only 15 people sit in the room. The other 15 is remotely. Or they get all 30 people and make the room double. So this is still talking that what is the trend? Where should they go, right? The other thing is about the microphone, the acoustic microphone. People are very worried about the sanitation, how to clean the microphone, right? The windshield, those kind of things. So if Televic can think about this, that the sanitation of the microphone, because some of the room they are sharing one microphone for two people, right? So we don't have every room that they have dedicated 1-to-1 microphone. But if they're doing 1-to-2, so in terms of sanitation and everything is very important, right? So that's my comment on that.
Gavin, what are some of the challenges that you're facing with all the councils that you've been working with, all the projects that you've done, and maybe even supporting them down the road?
Well, appetite doesn't seem to be a problem, so that's a good thing. Obviously, COVID's helped us with that. I'd say the biggest challenge that we face with these significant chambers type projects is the scope of works. So the typical sort of integration challenges we have in a construction environment. So who's responsible for what? And probably the biggest one is the network side of things. So we've all experienced the objection from enterprise and business to be able to put in the AV equipment on networks, etc. And that's still an issue. However, with education, seemingly more and more people are willing to do that, to join these systems onto their network. But otherwise, it's just the normal the construction type challenges. We talk about spaces, for instance. So that's an interesting point, because even in the chambers spaces, the councils that we've been dealing with are looking at new buildings and fitting out new offices, for instance. So they're taking into consideration this social distancing could be a thing. So these spaces are becoming larger because of that. They don't want to have to go through the process again of having to exclusively work offline when they could socially distance, because a lot of the existing places, they had to go online because they just physically couldn't socially distance.
Didier, you actually raised one of the challenges in one of your previous answers, which was about the remote participant. You very rightly highlighted VC is meant for two people that are both remote participants. But when you take into account hybrid, right, you have people who are present in person, and then you have the remote participant coming in, and then you can really see the disparity in the experience and the presence of the two people. Can you expand a bit more on that challenge and how it can be solved? And also if there are other challenges you would like to highlight?
Yeah, sure. So as Gavin already said, I think the IT side of things is something that has expanded on that. Everybody wants to be hybrid, or at least have the capability. In Belgium, for instance, what we've seen, if the pandemic third wave was a little bit over, everybody got back to the city councils. It was only in certain occasions, if somebody needed to quarantine, or if there was a student that wanted to join from the university, for instance, that they applied a hybrid mode. But people want to be ready as soon as there's another wave, that they can easily switch from on-site to hybrid in a blink of an eye. So that's definitely something that we feel on the market. People want to be ready because it took quite some time to adapt, right? The second thing is also that not everybody is as IT savvy as we are, let's say. So that's definitely also a challenge. So there are more requirements regarding making sure that the customer is trained, that they know how to log into a meeting, how the operation works, etc. So that's definitely also an attention point that came on top of what we already had. But after all, I think the solutions that come on the market specifically for hybrid, and there's definitely room for improvement overall, let's say, has to do also with if you quickly have to add a participant, that they don't have to juggle around with installing applications. So that's also one of the reasons why we explicitly have chosen to have a web browser based application that ties into the physical room, and that's procedural wise and how you deal and interact with the conferencing solution is basically just a virtual representation of what you would do in the room. No changes in behavior from that perspective.
Gavin, I just want to throw the same remote participant question over to you because you highlighted the council who requested to be present remotely and to be able to vote and to be able to participate remotely. Now let's leave the legality of that aside, right? That's for the lawyers to debate. That's not for us. Let's talk about the presence part of it, the technology part of it. Was there ever a point where maybe perhaps a VIP for these meetings, someone like the mayor or someone who is very important to proceedings, did they have to be present remotely? And then did that really shine a spotlight on how bad remote presence is? Or was that a discussion point when you were installing the systems or specifying the systems and you just accounted for that at the start? So essentially my question is presence really being talked about for the remote participant in government spaces when you're doing these projects?
Yeah, so there's a one example was I think it was one of the executive, might have been the CEO of council, for instance, was actually on holidays at the time, so he had to actually join the chamber's meetings via audio on his phone, and that just was not a good experience. So whilst the audio worked, etc., it's just difficult to manage. So to Didier's point. And what I want to expand and say is that it's the workflow inside council chambers that makes that difficult. So, whilst we were trying to remove a whole bunch of contractors in the space, we find that there's a clerk in chambers that's solely responsible for managing that remote participant because of the lack of integration into the system. So, we might have one pane of glass to operate the entire chamber's experience, but then there's another clerk that's sitting beside that person that's just managing the external participants in Zoom or Teams or whatever. So all of a sudden we've doubled the headcount inside chambers that's potentially unnecessary. So it's workflow that needs to be addressed in this. But the desire to have remote participants, for instance, was prior to COVID. But I guess COVID's now just made that argument just so much easier from a technology point of view.
Didier, do you want to add on how easy it is to manage a system for someone who is not a trained AV professional if we go with Televic?
Yeah, sure. So basically, as I already said, the application is completely web-based. So there's no need to really install applications on a computer. So that already helps if you have like a new participant. Let's say council needs to invite an expert to talk about a certain topic. First of all, that expert doesn't have to drive to council anymore. So that's also kind of from that perspective is definitely also a good topic. But if that new person needs to be onboarded in the platform, he doesn't have to install. He just receives a link, and he basically has to create its account, and then he has the capability to join. So also in terms of the interface, we try to keep it as clean as possible, just the basic requirements that are required in order to have that procedural meeting has been applied, but for the rest, it is kept very clean. We also try to focus on the conversation itself. So and typically in government spaces, it's more of a directed conversation. So you have 2-3 people that are in a conversation, and rather than having all the Hollywood squares, we basically focus really on bringing only the people that have that conversation into picture, and that also helps in terms of the engagement between those people as well. So that's a little bit the things that we focused on in that respect.
We have a question from the audience that I would like Mr. Tawisak to answer. The question is that sometimes the government end users, they are very set in their ways. They don't want to change. They like to do things the way they like to do things. How do you convince them to change? Now, based on your answers, maybe they have changed. They're asking for more digital, they're asking for more hybrid, but how do you guide them to pick the right solution, to pick the solution that meets their requirements?
This is a good question, very difficult. We have to admit, right, that it's very difficult to change that behavior. But I think we have to thank you for the pandemic. This is the good thing about pandemic, that make people change, right? No matter you like or you don't want to change. The only thing we can do is to simplify the system, right? Trying to use technology to simplify the system, something like a touchscreen control, so that they, even with the touchscreen control, they still find it difficult sometimes. Yeah. So it's very difficult to answer this question, right? But they are changing. We have to accept that with this pandemic, many organizations, they are changing. People try to adapt themselves now. Yeah, no matter how old you are now, because in the past, many government people, when they are old people, they think we are old, we don't want to pay attention to technology. But if today they don't pay attention, they are out immediately. So the good thing about pandemic, they make people are now getting involved in the changes. Yeah.
Gavin, did you experience this friction between, what I assume is the education gap, right? They've been doing things a certain way. Now they're having to really shift very quickly, and that education gap can't really be traversed in a very short period of time. People need to learn, people need to adapt, people need to become comfortable, and that causes friction. How did you address this friction while you were working for the multiple projects that you have delivered in Queensland?
Well, fortunately for us, council recognises the value of support. So we have, we basically own the rights to the system, but up to a point where we don't operate it, but we're supporting the system on site during these meetings. So it's about education in these particular circumstances, because we have, willing participants and operators that are new to the actual systems. And then we just educate them accordingly with support from our guys on site at the time. So as my colleague mentioned, it's simplifying the systems and providing a single pane of glass, for instance, for them to operate, because they are highly complex systems doing a whole bunch of stuff automatically. And if something goes wrong, for instance, then we can assist. But up until that point, it's up to the council clerks to operate the meeting with the chairperson, and they really don't want any hassle. So that comes back to the interface and knowing the workflow of the meetings and what's expected, and run sheets, etc., etc.
Excellent. The last topic I would like to discuss before our Q&A session would be around security. Now, when it comes to government, security is very, very important, and some would say it takes on even greater importance than when we're talking about other sectors. AV has been asked this question a lot, right? Ever since we started converging with IT, security has come to the front. It is probably the first question that network administrators and IT professionals want AV to answer, and that is, how secure are your products, and how secure are your systems going to be that are going to sit on my network? Didier, security starts with the product, right? It has to. what are some of the steps that Televic is taking to ensure security is paramount importance?
Yeah, there's a couple of things actually, and that's something that we also seen over the years. It's not a surprise that IT departments are also getting more and more into play in AV solutions and products. So from that perspective, we also try to comply to the IT standards that are in place to guarantee that. One of the examples, for instance, is that we also recently added in our products IEEE 802.1x. So basically giving an IT department the means of also giving access only when those certificates are compliant. So that offers also the IT departments to deal with a conferencing solution the way they would treat any other type of equipment, IT equipment within their facilities. So that's also helping to speak the same language actually with the IT department. Is definitely something that really helps in that respect. On the other hand, while in the past, as I mentioned already, due to COVID, we got a lot of requests for wireless solutions. In the past, there was really a hesitance to use wireless in government applications. But now, seeing the fact that they have experienced the flexibility those solutions can offer, we get a lot more requests for wireless as well. Obviously, the security question is still there, but with our new 4th generation of wireless solutions, we've basically taken a step up where we comply with the AES encryption, which is basically not the personal grade level encryption, but the enterprise version, which means that basically each device will negotiate encryption keys with the access point rather than having one system-wide key that somebody has to manage. After all, those encryption keys also change. So whenever there's a restart of the system, the encryption keys will change automatically. And that will be done for each individual device. So that would mean that whenever there would be a possibility that somebody has a G4 system, he will even not be possible to join into that meeting because there's different levels of access to that. Through the access point, that doesn't work because you have the authentication process there with the IEEE 802.1x. From a Unix perspective, you also have a kind of open the gate, close the gate procedure. So whenever only those devices are allowed to connect. And then on top of that, the 3rd level is then the authentication between the access points in terms of communication, both on the data and also on the voice. Obviously, voting is in a lot of those cases also one of the things. So that is also important that communication is also guaranteed. Taking it from without the room into the hybrid is where we make the connection between a cloud platform and the physical room. We have a component in between there, which is the gateway, which actually acts as an intermediate towards connecting to the cloud platform. And there's also end-to-end encryption from that gateway in the room up until the web browser from the remote participant. So those are a little bit of topics in terms of security that we have added into the total solution, let's say.
That's right. Gavin, again, right, IT and AV convergence, it's happened. It's been going on for a very long time. But the question around security, right, like when you were talking with the councils for these projects, were you able to just go in there and go like, yes, we speak the same language, right? You send over your security requirements and we cross-reference that with the products that we have. And we're like, yes, 100%, everything's on board. We can meet these requirements. Or is it still a bit of a muddled conversation with back and forths and scrambling to make sure that it is all above board?
So yeah, so prior to deploying these systems, obviously council, they had their own inside security documents, and to be frank, well, I didn't even know what half of it actually meant, what they're actually asking. So we had to go to our solutions architect, who actually created a document for our business to address those particular queries and questions. A lot of them were, you know, they have to obviously ask every single question. Many of them didn't actually apply to us at all, but nevertheless, we still had to respond. But having said all that, we were able to comply with council's requirements. But what we've done, and whilst I said earlier that businesses are tending to have an appetite to put these solutions on their own home networks, we've deployed these isolated. They're sort of completely isolated from council's networks. So we build AV LANs, for instance, that are isolated from council's main network, and the only point at which any of our AV appliances touches that council network is the streaming appliance, which obviously goes up to YouTube or wherever it goes. So we're able to draw a line in the sand and say, this is not, network or council's able to draw a line in the sand and say, network is not council's problem. That's an AV problem. So, and for us, when we're delivering systems as a service, for instance, then that gives us a level of comfort to say, well, we can't blame council for a network issue. It is solely our responsibility. So, yeah, while security is an issue, with these particular systems, we've been successful in isolating those from those particular networks.
Mr. Tawisak, what are the security requirements like in Thailand? What are the conversations around security that you're having with your government clients?
I think the AVIT conversion make the IT people play bigger role in the security, and the IT people, they pay more attention to IT than in the security than the AV people. I remember 20 over years ago when we did United Nations conference room in Bangkok. We are trying to emphasize the audio encryption function, but they're not interested, right? They don't want to talk about it, right? And that is from the AV head of department, right? And when we talk about the security in the government project, they always think about military. But for the audio conference room, they say they don't care so much. But now, when the audio system take control by the IT guy, now they talk about the audio encryption. They talk about the network thing and everything, right? So this is getting more attention and more important. But right now, when we talk about the wireless system, they still have an argument about the RF wireless or infrared wireless, because they believe that the infrared is safer than the RF. I think this question I have to ask DDA also. Yeah. So what should be our argument if we have some question that the wireless? I agree that there are more requirement on wireless nowadays, but they're still talking about either RF or the infrared technology. Yeah.
Didier, there's also a question on this exact same topic from our audience, which is wired option more secure than wireless options, right? So I think we can tag that together with Mr. Tawisak's question about RF and infrared when it comes to wireless. And maybe you can run us through the security landscape for wired and wireless options and then the different wireless options.
Yeah, sure. I think it's also a little bit a perception, and it's something that we have to turn around, and it's a collective thing that we have to do. It's about education and also explaining why a wireless solution is as secure as a wired solution. You could even say that a wired solution, in a sense, is less secure, because if there are connectivity points within the room, it's far easier to have something connected there and sneak in than you would be on a wireless, because it's a total different thing. So from that perspective, I think it's more about education, proving that the solutions are secure, giving reports, test reports, etc., comply to industry standards that are out there and known by IT departments really helps in that respect. And that's also a deliberate choice why we have using a standard that is really high-grade secure rather than trying to implement an encryption algorithm ourselves. So those are the things I think that we should keep on doing, and I have the impression overall that it has gone better in that respect over the last couple of years. And in that respect, I think the whole fact that IT is more involved also helps in that respect.
Gavin, the last question on this topic of security, I'd like to throw over to you. Didier has really elaborated the security options that Televic is providing and how much they're paying attention to security, right? He was talking about IEEE standards and certification that come with Televic products. He was even talking about, hey, we're even considering the gateway between the cloud and our product and ensuring that that's secure. So obviously on the product side, security is being taken very, very, very seriously. But then when I see on the app, the deployment side, how AV is actually deployed, right? That one connection with the general network and the AV network, right? Just VLANing it out and putting it in its own little sandbox, that still seems to be the most secure way of deploying AV networks that need to piggyback or connect with the main networks. When so much work is being done on getting these products up to scratch, in terms of security, speaking the same language as IT, meeting all their standards, and complying with everything that they want, and yet in the end you just go like, hey, I'll just VLAN it, right? Is that going to change, or is that just so effective in providing that extra layer of security that you think that that's going to continue and it's going to be the norm for the next foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think for us, it's the path of least resistance. So obviously we're familiar with this. We've done this before. And we can tell the customer, that security is not a problem except for this particular item, and just focus on that particular item, because the effort that we had to go through to get this particular streaming device to meet their requirements. I mean, they needed to know the manufacturer's chip providers' security policies. Like, it was just ridiculous. So for us, it's just too hard. As an integrator, we've obviously got to get in, get out, and move on to the next project. So whilst we do have these conversations with customers, it inevitably leads to the question about, well, what about remote access? So we want to support these systems. So if you were to put it, you get over the hump of the conversation about putting these systems on their networks, but then you realise, well, what about remote access? And that's when another conversation begins. So if we isolate them, it's just the path of least resistance, including remote access, and therefore we can provide a complete support package, not only deliver the outcome, the products and the outcomes that, to meet requirements, but also to provide support for these systems, and without having to sort of invest time, energy, and effort too much into the network discussion. So yeah, it's a perennial conversation, it goes round and round, but more than ever, they're still isolated.
No, perfect answer. It's an answer that I'm also seeing from other AV integrators that are in other sectors, right? The corporate is a really good example. They face the same problems where you just VLAN it, and then that way it's just a conversation for a later date, right? We can talk about it.
Yeah, there's that comfort for the customer, like I said earlier, where, well, they can't use that as an excuse. Yeah. So because it's not on our network.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. We are now going to open the field to questions. So our audience members, if you guys have any questions, now would be the time to ask them. I've tried to weave a lot of your questions already into the conversation, but if there are any additional topics other than the ones that we've already discussed that you would like to ask, now would be the time. While we wait, gentlemen, I have a very short question, and that revolves around the government, right? It's, from my personal opinion, it's been a bit of a hodgepodge of their they haven't really transitioned properly, at least from my experience sitting here in Singapore. Has it really been the same on your side? I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, have they implemented the right strategies in your opinion, or do you think there are still room for improvement? Mr. Tawisak, maybe you can answer whether the Thai government has been very effective in responding to the challenges of the COVID and still serving the people.
Yeah, I think so. Right now, what the government doing in terms of the conference room is correct. It's a hybrid system that they're trying to do it. Even the Prime Minister himself is trying to join in many conference meeting, right? But in the Congress room in the Parliament, we don't see any changes. They still have to do manually, physically, everything the same. They just put in the plastic partition. So the government in the Parliament, they don't change their behavior, right? Everybody have to be present, and which is something that still not changed so much. But among the organization, they do the hybrid. Yeah, I think that's the right way. Yeah.
Gavin,
we agree. Yeah.
Gavin, you've talked a lot about the councils, right? But Australia-wide, I know that it might not be homogenous all across. And again, right, like Mr. Tawisak just put in some really nice insight about the top echelons. It was like Parliament, there were no changes. You just put in the dividers. Is it the same in Australia?
It sort of amazes me, and it's probably the same all over the world, that, you know, if a particular council does something well, then I would have thought the next council over there would look at that council and say, well, let's just do what they're doing. So that seems to be evolving and changing for our benefit. So, you know, in the recent history, you know, we'll deploy a successful chambers outcome and experience, and then the next council, you know, obviously I wouldn't be doing my job if I was telling that council that they really should be buying this. So, but that on its own is not enough. It's got to be a good experience and a good outcome, and that council's got to be actively advocating that. So, you know, from my point of view, that it's slowly learning from each other and adopting the same sort of practices, etc. Most of the time, the way that they behave is pretty similar, except for the really large councils who sort of behave a bit like a parliament. Most of the regional councils will act sort of similarly. So, you know, on one hand, I'm surprised, and there's always these conversations about, you know, they've got different finance measures and different platforms, etc. But from an AV perspective and a chambers experience, it's slowly being recognised that, you know, there's a good way to do it. They're having a good experience down the road, so why don't we do it that way?
We have a question from the audience, Didier, and I think you're best placed to answer it. And the question is about global trends. So the question asks that there are differences in how people communicate, say in Asia Pacific versus EMEA versus the Americas. And Mr. Tawisak pointed out one of these things, which is in Asia Pacific, we really like to have gooseneck microphones. They're almost a staple whenever it comes to formal communication. Another one that the question puts forward is push to talk. That is something where in Asian cultures, you have to request for permission in order to speak and share your opinions, and that request has to be approved by whoever is leading that particular discussion. And this might be absent in other cultures, and hence the requirement for push to talk does not exist. Taking into account that we've gone digital, we've gone hybrid, right? Has that had a standardizing effect across the board? Will the way we communicate in these formal settings become more standardized, more homogeneous, more same across the region? Or do you feel that like these intricacies of how we communicate regionally have carried over into the digital realm as well?
Yeah, well, I think in that respect, the pandemic will probably also have been changed. We are more and more also kind of used to raise the hands from the applications that we're using here. And especially because now more of those camera tracking solutions come into play. And if you really want to automate it, there's no better way than dealing with request to speak and making sure that everybody gets its turn without kind of having camera tracking solutions that don't know how to interact anymore. Obviously, there are camera tracking solutions that are based on voice, but for those typical applications that we're operating in, that's not the ideal solution. So if you start to explain that to customers, they really get it. And the ultimate goal for them is also the recording streaming, in order to make sure that this is also a decent quality and that it's not something that is jumping around all the time. So the end result is really for them also the streaming and recording. And if you explain the procedure on how a camera tracking solution works without the need to have an additional resource to do the camera tracking, I think that really also helps in that respect. So I do believe, and I've seen also over the last 2 years, that the request to speak is really something that is being used more and more.
Mr. Tawisak, can you shed some light on customer behavior or communication etiquette in Thailand when it comes to these government settings and these formal settings? And has it changed? Has it remained the same?
In the conference system, they have many more, like automatic FIFO, manual or whatever. We try to explain to the government user that, hey, you have many more to do your conference, but end up they're doing automatic or request to speak. They're still not comfortable with voice activate, those kind of things, right? So in the Thai government market is still using automatic push to talk. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Gavin, you referenced, hey, one council is doing this, another council should just go like, I want the exact same thing. But then you also highlighted, if that's the case, then you're not doing your job. You're not providing them a service. You're not providing them an excellent experience. But to the point of standardization and homogeneity for meeting experiences and formal communication experiences, are you seeing that because of digital? Are you seeing like those little nuances between how one council does it and another council does it change in Australia?
Yes, although it's being driven by these successful outcomes, because it's a bit like, you know, keeping up with the Joneses is a saying. So, you know, if it's a good experience in one council, then why shouldn't we be doing it? And it really comes down to what the product looks like. So, you know, we have the responsibility to record audio and record video for all those legal reasons, but you also want it to look good when it goes out to the stream. So, you know, the old school sort of quad view with 4 CCTV cameras, for instance, just doesn't cut it compared to what we can deliver now. And it's a pretty easy and compelling argument when you just send an example of a successful outcome and what that looks like. It sort of sells itself.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but that topic that you just came up with regarding, hey, we've moved to digital, but these things are also being streamed, and now it's almost like, hey, do we need to build in complete event or show production capabilities into conference systems just so that they can have a good output? That could be an entire 1-hour conversation on its own. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. It has been an extremely fruitful discussion, in my opinion. To our participants, thank you so much for attending. We hope that we've been able to address all your questions. We hope that if there were any more, you can reach out to us via email. Feel free to reach out to Televic. Feel free to reach out to Inavate. We can connect you with any of these other individuals as well, from Vichai Trading 1983 and from Pro AV Solutions, if you want to just continue the conversation. But once again, thank you so much, guys. And hopefully we can see you in 2022 and talk about show production. Maybe we can even do it in person. All right, guys.
We hope so.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for joining.
Have a good day, guys.
Bye-bye.